Okay, you're here to see a video about sculpting, so we're gonna get started right away. Today I am using Monster Clay, which is an oil and wax-based clay. It's reusable, so I really like it for my molding and casting projects. Once I'm done with a figure, I can just melt it down and reuse it for another figure later on. So I'm starting here just blocking out the base shapes. I have the clay heated up. I like to melt it down in a microwave in a little cup and then just let it cool off a little bit so it solidifies. And then before it cools all the way, I like to block out the big shapes while it's easy to mold. And then as it starts to cool down, we can start moving into the more secondary forms. Right here I'm putting in the eyes. Couple of ball bearings for eyes. Makes it easier to sculpt around rather than using clay. And I'm just marking in the lines for the mouth. It's kind of hard to see from this angle. There we go. So I'm just slowly building up form with little pieces of clay. Right now I am building up the different planes of the face. And you may have noticed I didn't start with an armature at all. Oftentimes with Monster Clay you don't need an armature, just depending on what you're making and the type of pose that you're going to do. You really don't need an armature. This guy, he's pretty simple, so I opted to just start with the clay and not even bother with the armature. Monster Clay does a really good job of holding itself up, especially once it cools off. And it does react to the heat in your hands, so just working it a little bit with your hands will soften it up enough to sculpt with. And normally I don't jump into detail quite this fast. However, I've never sculpted an axolotl or anything similar to it, so sometimes getting the face details in early on helps me figure out the rest of the figure and the proportions and everything. And honestly, this was just looking so abstract with just the main shapes that I had to get something on there that resembled what I was going to be making. So notice how easy it is to sculpt around those ball bearings. If that was clay, it would be squishing around all over the place. So those really come in handy. You can get those on Amazon or hardware stores. They come in bulk packets. You can just keep those on hand in a couple different sizes for your various projects. And now I have moved on to the rest of the body, adding some more clay where I need it, kind of getting it into the shape that I want before adding any more details. And now here you will see I am adding in the first limb, and I thought at first I could get away with just the clay. But ultimately, I decided that wasn't going to hold itself up, because I did want him propped up a little bit. So I decided to add in some wire, just for a little bit of support, since his weight is going to be resting on those feet. I really wanted just a little extra support for that weight. Just a little bit of aluminum armature wire, very easy to bend and cut. Definitely a tool you want to keep on hand. And here I am adding a little more bulk to make sure those arms are coming out to the side evenly. And here's another detail I wouldn't put in till later on, but I really wanted it to look like what I was sculpting, to give me a little bit of point of reference for those arms as well, making sure they were connecting in the right spot. And now moving down the body again, adding more clay to the tail and the hip area. And I really like to use these large loop tools to kind of define the anatomy. Right there, I just defined the ribcage torso area a bit so I could better find an anchor spot for the leg. And I'm just roughing in the limbs at this point, and you'll see later on I go through quite a few iterations of those limbs. At any rate, I am still refining those forms there, building up the rib cage a little bit so he's not so flat. Always be constantly turning your sculpture when you work. You really want to make sure the forms look right from every angle. If you work too long from one angle, you risk turning the sculpture around and having everything look a little strange. So just evenly work on each side. I did the first leg, and now I am going and putting in the second leg just to make sure they're even, and adding those little fins on the side of the other side of the head. Just slowly building up the forms, adding in some toes. You can just pinch off little pieces of clay and then smooth them into the rest of the foot. And now I am adding a center line with this tool. That is going to be where I place the back fin later on. And going back and redefining that torso area, the rib cage. You'll notice that I resculpt quite a few things. That's very common. Just as you work, things will get mushed out of place. Here I'm adding the back fin, just slowly building that up and pinching it to help keep it thin, and just smoothing those bits of clay together. And now using my loop tool to both smooth it out and make sure it's thin enough. I don't want a really thick, bulky fin. I want it to be nice and thin. Adding on some clay for the hands, just covering up that bit of wire, and then adding the fingers on top of that. Doing details like this, it's best to wait till the clay cools off because it can be very difficult to work with small pieces of clay when it's warmed up. And now that the clay is cool, I am going in and adding some of the texture detail, just with my trusty line tool. Even though this guy is going to be relatively smooth, it's nice to have a little bit of texture in there to break that up a bit. And I'm just making sure the texture is even on both sides, lining up the lines from the other side. And here is the first redo of the back limbs. This is actually another session where I sat down and I just did not like how those legs were looking at all, so off they come. And while I had the X-Acto, I went and did some shaving down of the back fin, just getting that looking right, and doing some more clay removal with the loop tool. And here I'm replacing the arms as well. I noticed they were just way too close to the head after looking at some of my reference photos, so I am just pulling those out and repositioning them, just sticking the wire back in to the body. This is why I don't go into detail or smooth anything out too much from the start, because chances are I'm going to need to redo something or adjust something. If I'd spent all that time on detail, I would have had to undo it all. I created a little anchor point for the legs, and I am rebuilding those. I do end up rebuilding this leg once again. It's very tricky how these back legs sprout out. I'm so used to mammals. Amphibians and reptiles are just so different how their limbs sort of connect to the body. I also had done another sculpture prior to this. When I first sat down, I had started a whole separate sculpture that I ended up scrapping. So keep in mind, sometimes you're not going to sit down and just get it right the first try. This is my second try. I just could not wrap my head around the forms and how they connected. So I did a kind of a practice sketch before this, and I was going to show you guys, but it actually just really wasn't that interesting. It was just be watching me sculpt the same thing twice. So these little fins, I decided I wanted to make them look like leaves. So I'm just going in and sculpting that center vein for the leaf, kind of prepping this to do the final smoothing and detail work. So right here I have a mixture of isopropyl alcohol and isopropyl myristate that helps to smooth out the clay. I just brush it over the sculpture and then smooth everything out with my fingers and with these rubber tools. You want to wait until the very end to apply this because it does wipe away detail. If you have too much myristate, it can melt areas. That's why it is good to put the isopropyl alcohol in there as well to cut back that detail removal and that melting. So now I'm adding in that fine detail that the myristate could have erased. Then I brush over a little bit to smooth out those lines and just refine everything with my tools. I'm going to be doing the same thing on the back fin here. Just going to smooth it out with my fingers and then go back in and add some detail. I want that to look like sort of like a half of a leaf, so it's going to have that same veining texture on there. I'm just carefully smoothing everything out. It's a little difficult to see here, but I am adding in very fine veining detail. So it's got that leaf texture. And by the way, this tool I'm using is really my go-to tool. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's made by Kemper. I go through so many of these loop tools. They're well made. I just really abuse the heck out of them because it's definitely one of my go-tos. So if you're interested in any of the tools I'm using, actually, I'm going to put links to them in the description. These rubber tools are another favorite of mine. They're great for getting in tight areas where your fingers can't reach, so you can smooth out like how I'm going along seams and in the little areas behind the ear fins that are harder to reach with my hand. It's great for those rubber tools. Notice also I'm not brushing the entire figure with the alcohol just right off the bat. I work in small areas. I make sure the last part I brush is the part that I was holding the sculpture the whole time. So I was mostly holding onto his torso while I was smoothing out the rest of the figure. That was the last place I used the alcohol on. Now, unfortunately, I did forget to do a final turnaround video of this sculpture when I was done, so you're just kind of getting a look at the final figure here, and I will also throw up a photo at the end. I'm going to be doing a video on how I mold and cast this guy, so this definitely isn't the last you see of this little axolotl. I hope you enjoyed watching me sculpt. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. And if you got anything out of this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you guys once again, and I will see you in the next video.